Greetings. We want to welcome you to our Cleveland Unitarian Universalist Forum this morning. My name is Wayne Jennings, a member of our forum committee, and I'm the host for today's discussion on the economy and COVID-19. Our community forums always cover a wide variety of issues that affect us personally as well as the communities in which we live. Today's topic is an excellent example. Although we can't discuss our forum topics with you in person, we want to thank you for participating in this webinar so that all of us can grow and deepen our knowledge about this topic, collectively as well as virtually. We can't offer you tea or coffee like we used to at our main church, but we hope you are enjoying your morning cup as you listen and participate in our discussion. The title for today's forum is The Economy and COVID-19, What's Next? This is an extremely important topic. In addition to the health crisis we are experiencing, the U.S. economy is already in a recession. How serious might the economic impact of COVID-19 be? How long might it last? How many trillions of federal dollars will it take to mitigate the economic impact of closed local and national businesses? How can we collectively and financially deal with the 26 million people who are unemployed? We need to align our strengths to the urgency of COVID-19 and develop equitable financial strategies for both near and long term, and also for the underserved and lower income families in our communities. These are huge issues, and we're fortunate to have our guest speaker share his knowledge with us this morning. I would like to now introduce Mark Sniderman, former Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and he is currently at the Case Western Reserve Weatherhead School of Management, where his teaching and academic interests are focused on macroeconomics, financial regulation, and the monetary policies being employed by central banks to promote financial stability. During his former Federal Reserve career, Dr. Sniderman served as principal advisor to the bank president for economic and financial policy. As the senior executive officer, Dr. Sniderman also led the bank's economic research program and chaired the bank's senior policy committee. And before we turn this over to Dr. Sniderman, I want to give you one more reminder about the questions. You are, as an attendee, muted, but if you go to the bottom of your screen and find the Q&A button, you can type in your question and send. And somewhere a little bit after 10 o'clock, we will start the Q&A. But you can send those questions anytime, and our question handlers will filter them and present them to Dr. Sniderman. So without any more hesitation, Dr. Sniderman, it's all yours.
Great, good morning. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Good morning to all the rest of you who are here. I too wish I could join you for a cup of coffee together, but we'll have to drink individually this morning. I'm going to go through some slides for you, and let's see if I can get them up here. Let me do my screen sharing. All right, I guess I should ask if you can see my slides.
Looks good.
Anyone?
Yes.
All right, good. Great. Okay, so let me run through this. And I guess the overall message I want to leave you with is, at the moment, because there's so much unknown about COVID-19 and its progression as a disease and what it's going to take for us nationally to get it under control, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty about its effects on the economy, both in terms of the magnitude and the timing. So I'm going to give you kind of an overall sense of what's going on at the moment and talk a little bit about one forecast you could look at to serve as kind of a reference point for your thinking. And then we can have some conversation about this as well. So let's do this. Okay, so first I want to talk about an economic recession, what an economic recession is, because I believe that we're going to find out that the economy entered a recession in March. Think of a recession as a sort of a reinforcing cycle of events. I'm going to start this with the pandemic that you see in the upper left. The pandemic has clearly induced a decline in consumer confidence, household confidence about going outside, going to work, going to stores. In addition to of course, the confidence factor itself, we have government orders to stay at home. This leads to a decline in sales, obviously. The decline in sales leads to a fall in profits for companies. The decline in profits for companies leads to declines in output of goods and services themselves, which in turn leads to falling incomes and profits. And the declines in income and profit fall, back around again to lead to further declines in people's confidence because they have less income, less job security. Companies there's concern about companies being able to reopen again. So this kind of reinforces the spiral. In fact, you might think of it, I've drawn like a little downward spiral here on the left-hand side. The pace of economic activity itself first slows a little bit, and then it just sort of, declines further and further and further as this vicious cycle reinforces itself. So we see kind of cumulative declines in a lot of different kinds of economic activity. So let me start with consumer sentiment. This is a picture of a graph. This is a graph of consumer sentiment from one particular kind of survey that's conducted every week. And that's the advantage of this one. There are many other consumer confidence surveys, but they're typically done monthly. This is a weekly one. And you can just see how quickly the decline in confidence as measured by this particular survey kicked in once we got into early March, early mid-March. I've got a couple of graphs here showing other elements of this cycle that I mentioned to you. On the left-hand side, you can see a picture about unemployment insurance claims. There are two lines, a red line and a blue line. The red line is initial claims. So this is when a person who is laid off files for the first time for their claims benefits. And one of the things you're going to see that's common in a lot of these pictures is the magnitude of the scale here. If I had shown you a picture of initial claims a couple of months ago, the scale itself would have gone just from 0 to maybe, 500,000 or 700,000 would have been the top line, and you'd see the little red line kind of wiggling a lot. But now to accommodate this enormous magnitude of initial claims, which peaked up here at, close to about 7 million one week. So we had this huge increase in initial claims. The subsequent weeks of initial claims have been very high, of course, enormously high, but coming off that peak. So the big rush came really, really early, and we're still continuing to see new claims for unemployment insurance filed, in the millions. But I think the last report was 4.4, not anywhere close to 7. The blue line is the continued claims. So it's people who continue to be on the unemployment insurance rolls. So it's kind of the cumulative sum of what's going on when you add in all the initial claims week after week after week as people stay as claimants on the unemployment insurance system. And then on the right-hand side graph, the fairly familiar unemployment rate. We're all pretty familiar with the unemployment rate. And here our unemployment rate had been trending down over the course of the year as the economy was really in very, very good shape before the arrival of COVID-19. So we had reached an unemployment rate of about 3.5%. And in the last survey, of course, it shot up to 4.4, and we're expecting to see that to go much higher over the coming months. To show you some more pictures about the elements that are in my reinforcing cycle. So this green line on the left-hand side chart is retail sales for clothing and clothing accessories. You can see how rapidly this just completely plunged. These are in millions of dollars. Just completely fell off the charts. Now, of course, spending for other kinds of items, such as food, clearly have been holding up, and certain products in the food category, actually rising. But we're not buying clothes. We're buying other things, and there are many, many other things that we're not buying. So clothes was just an example to illustrate how quickly retail sales from many, many categories are falling off. I thought you might be interested in this blue line. It's the fraction of total sales that are conducted through e-commerce. We're at a little past 11% on that now. That number clearly has been rising. When we get some more monthly data on this, we're going to see that number ticking up. So it's been growing over time anyway, but e-commerce as a source of sales during this stay-at-home period clearly are accelerating. On the right-hand side picture, you can see industrial production. As I mentioned, the decline in confidence leads to fall off in sales, and then the fall off in sales leads to declines in production. So the blue line on the top is the industrial production index, and you can see how sharply that thing has declined. And the red one is the industrial production index for manufacturing. So it's a subcomponent of the overall index, but it's one of the ones that in particular, is driving that overall industrial production index down. And of course, the stock market, very sharp declines. Now we're used to sharp declines in the stock market. The blue line is the S&P and the red line is the NASDAQ. I've scaled these so that they are each set at 100, an index value of 100 at the beginning of the year 2017. So these are not, the real values that we'd read in the newspaper, but by looking at the lines, you can get a sense of, by how much the stock markets, as measured by these two, the S&P and NASDAQ, how much they've grown just over the past few years prior to the pandemic, from a value of 100 up to 180 in the case of the NASDAQ, and 150, so 50% increase in the S&P and 80% increase in the NASDAQ, and then this very, very sharp correction. Some people are surprised to see the rebound here, given all the bad news, but as you probably know, the initial declines are where a lot of fear and panic set in. And so in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, there's often huge sell-offs, and then people get more information, start reappraising the situation, and as the incidence of infections and reported deaths have come in lower than some of the worst expectations, the market has sort of moved part of the way back up. We're still below the peaks in either one of these series that we were prior to the pandemic, but it looks like maybe almost half the losses have been regained. Finally, I wanted to say something about the financial system. The financial system is actually, prior to the onset of the pandemic, in very, very good shape. We can thank actually the last Great Recession for that. There were a lot of reforms put in place in the aftermath of the Great Recession that required banks to not only hold more capital and to be more liquid, but also for the largest banking organizations, they annually get subjected to stress tests by banking regulators. They're given a lot of different kinds of scenarios in which they have to be able to demonstrate that they're capable of withstanding high degrees of stress to the economy. So the banking system actually was in very, very good shape. And what we see in this picture to the left is the percent change in commercial industrial loans by all commercial banks. And just as we get to the last data point here in this chart, there's a huge increase. That's from a lot of companies drawing on their pre-approved credit lines. Let's see, it looks like I lost my screen share. Should be back now. Think? Yes? Yeah, okay. I don't know why it disappeared, but there it is. So a lot of companies drawing on their credit lines, and that's why there's this big surge in loans. A lot of companies, as you can imagine, just like households, they have a lot of fixed obligations that they have to pay. They've got debt service, they've got rent, they've got a lot of things, and they don't have much revenue coming in. So many of them have to draw on their credit lines to be able to meet their obligations. Clearly, many of them have payroll obligations as well. On the right-hand side, we have the banking system showing their borrowings. The banking system has borrowed a lot from the Federal Reserve to meet some of this short-term demand for loans. So banks, when they make loans, they actually have to have some deposits coming in to make the loans. If they have pre-approved credit lines and they've got to honor those credit lines and extend credit, and they don't have an immediate influx in deposits, they can turn to the Federal Reserve System to borrow, which is what they've been doing. And the Fed has signaled its willingness to be very generous in providing credit to the banking system. So you might ask, how much is all of this going to cost? We have deployed an enormous array of support programs at the federal level, unprecedented. One thing that's really different about the way the federal government has responded to this crisis is, again, sort of learning from the last Great Recession. Their obvious difference the last time around was that in the last Great Recession, the shock came initially to the financial system. The financial system was discovered to be, say, undercapitalized and not liquid, and started crumbling. And so virtually all the federal assistance went to shore up the banking system. And that proved to be the correct medicine. But there were a lot of complaints in the aftermath of that, the federal government hadn't been responsive enough to households that were affected by the financial crisis, to small businesses who were affected by the financial crisis. And so this time around, we have a wide array of programs that have been developed to support various segments in our economy. And of course, this crisis is different. It didn't originate in the banking system. We don't have any truly special programs going in to help commercial banks. We have programs going to help households because households can't go to work, and so they're unemployed because of social distancing and government restrictions. And we have businesses that have been told they have to shut down. So for a variety of equitable reasons that clearly make sense, these support programs are deployed in many different directions. So we have some aspects of the federal response that are channeling money directly to hard-hit businesses. The first you might think of are airlines, for example, but there are others. We have the well-publicized Paycheck Protection Program that provides assistance to small businesses through the SBA if companies will keep their employees on payroll. They can use the money for continuing payroll and for rent and certain other approved expenses. And those loans that are going to be given to them for those purposes, if they meet the criteria, the loans will be forgiven. So this is to, keep people on the payroll. We have cash assistance for families, direct checks mailed directly to homes. We have extensions of unemployment insurance, so federal supplement on top of whatever the state programs are providing. We have some funds going directly to hospitals and other healthcare providers to help them get the equipment, tests, and things like that that they need. And then we have some support to certain components of the financial markets that are under stress as a result of companies normally being able to rely on funding themselves in financial markets during times of stress, finding the financial markets unable to meet the task. That includes, by the way, some state and local governments who normally borrow money in the financial markets, and because state and local governments are going to experience a shortfall of tax revenue, right at the same time they too have extra expenses. State and local governments are without the support being provided through these programs, would normally have difficult meeting their obligations as well. They would, be short-term borrowers in the financial markets, and then when all the tax revenue comes in, they would pay off their short-term borrowings. Well, now a lot of people are reluctant to lend them money in the short term because, we're well aware of the fact that they're going to have tax revenue shortfalls. So there's financial market support to the state and local governments as well, so that they can continue to operate smoothly. It's kind of a moving target. When I added up the various support programs, I came up to about $3.75 trillion so far. This includes the amounts that you get from how much extra spending has been approved, and also taking into account the less revenue. So this is not $3.75 million direct spend. This is the net of, I think a little under, the way I calculated it, maybe $2.75 of this is spending and $1 trillion of it less revenue or something like that. And then something that you don't see in here is there are a lot of loans that are being provided, some of which are designed to be forgiven, like the Paycheck Protection Program. But some of the support that's being provided, for example, in financial markets, those are typically being provided by the Fed, and those are loans that are expected to be repaid. So I don't show them in my $3.75 trillion total. So now I want to talk about, let me go back to this. I want to show you some pictures about the recovery. So there are a lot of questions asked about, well, how long is this going to last, and are we going to snap back from it, or is it going to take a long time? And as I said, I think what we're going to, what we all realize is it's the progression of the disease itself and the effectiveness of the stay-at-home orders. It's going to rely also on whether or not our scientists are able to come up with antiviral medicines that should people become sick, they can at least be treated well. We don't have those antivirals yet, but there are, clearly a lot of people working on them. And then the vaccine itself. So we don't really know if and when we'll get the vaccine, if and when we'll get the antivirals, but those things will all help to determine the severity of people staying at home, people's confidence about going out and continuing their normal lives. And then that feeds back, of course, into the economy itself. So I'm going to show you three shapes of recession recoveries. This comes from an article that was just published in the Harvard Business Review a few weeks ago. This is path that Canada took during the Great Recession. Canada was not affected very much by the Great Recession because it had a very, its banking and financial system is structured differently than the US, and it didn't have the same kind of meltdown that we did. So you can see that Canada did have a recession. This purple line or magenta line is, you can see the falling down below its growth trend. That was its recession. It came back fairly quickly. You can see if you twinkle your eye just right, that kind of looks like a V-shaped recovery. Fall down kind of fairly quick, coming back and getting back to its trend line. You could contrast that with the United States. So this was our experience in the aftermath of the Great Recession. We had a decline. It was more extended than Canada's was. And you can see clearly this U shape that emerges out of that. We didn't come back and continue growing along the same pre-crisis growth trend that we had prior. We sort of lost some output. We're growing back at the same rate probably that we did, maybe a little bit slower. But we never really regained all that lost output that we might have produced had we remained on the same growth trend. So that's a U-shaped recovery. And then the worst case kind of scenario, this happened to Greece in its well-publicized meltdown. They have obviously had a lot of social, political problems as well as economic problems. And this is what is often called an L shape, where you never even really resume growing at all. So if you read discussions about the economic outlook, you'll sometimes hear people talking about whether the U.S. should expect a V shape or a U shape or an L shape, and that's what people are talking about. So here's a picture that I drew for you. It's got this blue line, which is, you might think of as similar to this pre-crisis growth trend kind of line. It actually is an estimate of how our economy would grow if we were fully using all of our available resources, land, labor, and capital, and producing up to what's called our potential. You know, we always say we want all people to kind of grow to their potential. Well, this is kind of like if the economy could operate at its potential. And here you can see, just as you did in that other picture, the so-called U-shape recovery, recession recovery in the 2008-2010 period. Now in my picture, the red line actually goes back and hits the blue line because in my line, we're not back to the pre-crisis trend. We're back onto sort of a different trend line, which is our new potential. But you can still see that U-shaped recovery. And the main takeaway from this picture is look how long it took to close that gap. I mean, we had a kind of a long, slow economic recovery, and eventually somewhere around 2018, we kind of get back to our potential growth rate. So what might we expect this time around? Well, as I said at the outset, I've been looking at lots of different forecasts from lots of different kinds of organizations who do this professionally, as part of their business, and they're all over the map. It's really, really difficult to pin this down. Everybody's having to kind of make a lot of assumptions. Here's a picture that is based on a forecast that I'm going to show you next from the Congressional Budget Office. So the Congressional Budget Office, which is a pretty nonpartisan, kind of down the middle of the road organization, within the U.S. government, they just came out with some, their kind of estimates of what's going on. And I added it, so I took this, Great Recession period that I just showed you, And then I kind of added on based on how I was able to interpret their numbers. This isn't directly their forecast, but I took their numbers and I converted it into what I think this picture would look like. And you can see what looks kind of like a V, a really sharp decline in output, most of which is underway right now in the second quarter. We kind of have in the CBO projection a bit of a pickup kind of quickly in the third quarter and fourth quarter, and then things kind of slow down. And it takes a couple of years before we finally get back. So a really, really deep decline, much sharper decline than we had in the Great Recession. And then, you know, somewhat of a little bit of a faster picking back up than we did in that Great Recession period. But it looks like not till 2024, maybe, if I extended this out another year, would we get back to our pre-recession potential GDP trend. So this is the projection from CBO. They're in the first four columns, they kind of go quarter by quarter. I think the big takeaway is here in the first line. This is the percentage change in GDP, which is you know, all the goods and services, or equivalently, you can think of it as all the income generated in the U.S. economy. You can see they've got us declining in the first quarter. That's all March. That's when this all started. The biggest decline here in the second quarter. From one quarter to the next, you know, a decline of about an eighth. Oh. And then this picking back up, a you know, smart rebound in the third quarter, but nowhere near the magnitude of the decline in the second. And then we start growing more slowly coming out. If you look at the second line all the way to the last two columns, you'll see the four-quarter change in growth. So that is the fourth quarter of 2020 relative to the fourth quarter of 2019. That's a decline of 5.6%. And then next year, 2021, the four-quarter rate of growth is only half of that. So, so then we would need 2022, you know, to start catching up even some more. And then, as I said, it looks like it takes us till 2024 almost before we get all the way back. The unemployment rate in their projection peaks out at about 16% in the third quarter. Even at the end of 2021, we're still at 10%. So this is a really high unemployment rate for a long period of time. And of course, interest rates remaining rock bottom throughout this entire period. As far as deficits and debt are concerned, this is a quote from their report. With expected weakness, the deficit would be 17.9% of GDP in 2020, 9.8% in 2021. Those are huge increases because the deficit was only going to be about 4.5% of GDP last year, and it's projected, as you can see here, to be almost 18% this year. So it's a much larger increase in the debt to GDP ratio than you know, than we experienced last year or would have experienced in the absence of this pandemic. And the same with debt. Debt relative to GDP is going to be 20 percentage points higher at the end of 2020 and 26 percentage points higher at the end of 2021 than in the projections that they had prior to the pandemic. So a very large increase in the percent of GDP that you know, debt held relative to GDP. Very large increases, not surprisingly. So where does this leave us as a country? Well, we're going to have to expect changes when all this is over. I put together a really brief list just to stimulate your thinking, but there's all kind of changes, economic changes. A lot of companies are realizing that work at home works pretty well, much better than maybe they thought, and a lot of people are finding that work from home is satisfying to them in many ways that maybe they didn't think. So we're already hearing lots of discussions from companies about how maybe a mixed system of you know, some work at home and some work at the office might be in the future. Looks like I lost my connection again. Not sure why. So I'm trying to get it back up, but I'm on the last slide anyway. So I can't tell if I still have audio connection with you.
Yes, we can still hear you. We just lost the video feed.
Okay, so let me just conclude then, because I don't know how long it may take to connect that back. You know, the changes are going to be economic in a lot of ways. Businesses are going to be rethinking their supply chains, and there's a lot more debt outstanding for the U.S. government. Interest rates are going to stay really low for a long time. Households are probably going to be rethinking whether they should be saving more and living in ways that enable them to be more resilient during, you know, future such events. Yeah, there we go. We could lose a lot of smaller sized companies, and so we might find that bigger companies take over more market share. So, you know, on average, maybe larger companies, industries consolidating. A lot more concern in the social political sphere with equality. We're realizing that people who are most exposed and are on the front lines in all of this tend to be, you know, the less paid among us. And we're very dependent on them. And so I think a lot of attention going to be paid to equality and equity. Hopefully there'll be some serious thinking about how to have our healthcare system better prepared for future such events. That might include, I should add, I hope, more funding for research on diseases and epidemics and, you know, that sort of thing. There's going to be big discussions about privacy because there are a lot of reasons why businesses and or governments may want to monitor healthcare status of people. That's going to be an emerging issue over the coming months as we try to get on our feet again. How much information is going to be asked for about our health, and who's asking, and what are they going to do with it? And we're seeing differences of opinion among the states about opening up and the timing of that and civil liberties. And, you know, so there's going to be more discourse about all of this too. And then just finally, in the international sphere, we don't really know how the disease is going to affect the sort of ongoing livelihoods of people around the world, which countries are going to be most hard hit, which ones are going to come through, you know, relatively well. Companies, as I said, in the economic sphere are going to be rethinking their supply chains, and that's going to have effects on how much other countries can thrive, because they're typically relied on now to be supplying industries in the U.S. So if we relocate some of that, you know, how do they fare? This is probably, this whole episode maybe intensifying some of the friction in our relations with China. So this is just a brief list. There are a lot of other things that if I had another hour or so, I'd put more things on the list. You probably have your own ideas about what should be on the list. But I've talked enough maybe. I'll give up the screen sharing and turn it back over to to you guys for handling questions, and let's get the audience involved.
Great. Thank you for a very interesting presentation and stimulating. We have some questions, and I believe Debbie
Yep.
Debbie Wright is available to send them to you.
Yep. So the first question is, you said that banking was in good shape going into this crisis due to the regulations that were put in place after 2008 failures. What will the effect, do you think, of the current administration eliminating those regulations that made the bank safer going into this situation?
Well, there definitely have been some revisions in these regulations, and the overall thrust of them. So back at the time these things were put in place, my own prediction about it was that there was going to be probably more regulation put in place than would end up standing over the longer haul, because at the time the regulations were put in, it was almost like a kitchen sink approach. Everything that anybody could think of they thought was a good idea for regulating the institutions was thrown into the legislation. And some of the provisions, when you take them all together, sometimes they didn't work well. They didn't interact that well with one another. There were some redundancies, probably a lot more bureaucracy than ultimately was necessary. So I think after living with the regulations for some few years, it's probably a good idea to prune some of them back. We could probably get into discussions about which ones maybe are bridged too far, maybe that too much of a cutback. But overall, I don't think the revisions to the regulations overall in the big picture of things have compromised the basic thrust of the Dodd-Frank Act. I think the major provisions that led to more capital and more liquidity and more stress testing of the largest organizations has held up pretty well. So at the moment, I'm unconcerned about how much retrenchment has taken place.
Thank you. We are seeing the bulk of the money appropriated by Congress for businesses going to large corporations, to the extent that some are embarrassed and are returning the money. How can we work as citizens to see that money gets into the hands of those who need it?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if this turns out to be an unintended consequence of the way it was set up or not. But yes, I mean, so the interesting thing about this is generally about the Paycheck Protection Program. The SBA, in the U.S., a small business is defined as a company that has under 500 employees. So, a company that's got 400 employees, I don't personally think of that as a small business, but, in the grand scheme of things, given that we have some organizations that have tens of thousands and even larger employees, maybe that is small. So when they set this up, they said if you're a kind of a franchise thing like a Starbucks or a Shake Shack or one of these things, and you have a lot of different freestanding places, even though collectively it adds up to more than 500. So I think those are the kinds of organizations that have been a little embarrassed about taking the money. The key point is if you're a business that's large enough to be able to go to the public debt markets, if you can raise money by issuing securities in the capital market, there's enough other programs set up by the federal government, particularly operating through the Fed, that enable businesses to be able to borrow that way. And they shouldn't have to rely on some of these other programs where the money is intended truly for the smallest companies. So I'm glad that some of them are giving the money back. There's a pretty extensive monitoring system that's been put in place to act like it's an audit on all this. But here's the tension. If you set up a program that gets the money out the door really fast, you're undoubtedly going to find ex post that some of the money was inappropriately spent or given out. If you set up an elaborate controls procedure to make sure that no money goes out the door until, you know, every I is dotted and T is crossed and everything verified as far as what's on the applications, that money's not going to get out the door very quickly. And the need is for the money to get out the door very quickly because businesses are shut and people don't have work. And so, you know, there's a tension there. I have no doubt that all this stuff will be audited after the fact. So as citizens, you know, there's going to be a lot of public documentation of all of this. But at the moment, I think, you know, you just have to rely on people doing the best job they can to follow the rules and get the money out. One thing I would say is that, you know, in the case of the programs the Fed has set up, and I have some experience with this, you know, it took us a while in the last financial crisis to get some of these support programs up and running. There was no legal infrastructure or operational infrastructure for doing it, and it took a while to develop. But in this crisis, as soon as the crisis hit, the Fed was able to take the same programs, essentially, that they had already become familiar with from the last time and just take them like right off the shelf and get them up and running in a matter of like a week or two. So, you know, having some experience with this and institutional memory enables you to move a lot faster. And we're seeing with some of these federal programs, you know, these are first-time things. They've never been done before. So it's not surprising that we're seeing some of these glitches that we're reading about in the press.
Thank you. During the government created thousands of jobs during the Depression. In other words, the WPA, Civilian Conservation Corps, et cetera. Should the government consider doing something like that during this crisis?
I don't really think we're going to need to do that unless we really take a severe turn for the worse later in the year. As you can see from the CBO projection, and as I said, there are other projections. Some of them have further declines in the third quarter where the CBO sees things picking back up in the third quarter. You know, there are different patterns, but by and large, most likely we should see that by the time we reach the end of the year, you know, the economy is going to be growing again and businesses are going to be coming back online. It's not the kind of thing in the Great Depression where the whole economy was broken. This is sort of a self-imposed restriction on economic activity. We're doing it because we think it's the best way to get the virus under control. But it's not a matter of the underlying economy itself being weak. It's a matter of our choosing to slow it down, and it's going to pick up again once we get the virus under control. So I don't think we're going to need to go to those kind of extremes.
Yeah, thank you. What are your thoughts about the politicization of this virus and these economic issues and the impact on the November elections?
Well, it's not a surprising thing that it's being politicized because it seems that there's nothing in life in the U.S. anymore that seems to go unpoliticized. It's a sad thing in a way that we haven't been able to set that aside during this time, but it does seem that, and how it's going to come out on the elections, I think a lot of that is going to depend on the mood of the country at the time. If the economy is growing quickly again and we seem to have a pretty clear path for sailing, I think a lot of voters will be willing to excuse some of the slow starts and stumbling around. The death count has been much lower than people's worst fears. But, you know, there's a lot to be unhappy about in terms of how this thing is unfolded, and it depends, you know, on the last one to be able to predict about the election side of it. I mean, there's just too much unknown.
Right. There's another question about politics. In an election year, it's always the economy, and the questioner doesn't believe that the economy will shut down by politicians when the second wave hits this fall. I mean, I guess that's a question. If there's a second wave, what do you think will happen? Do you have any prediction?
Yeah, I think.
In terms of NASDAQ?
Yeah, I
and
mean,
S&P?
I do think that. Well, I do think that. Yeah, if it looks like there's a second wave coming. Now, if it's just a little bit of an echo, so things peak, the progression of the disease seems to slow, notably, and then as we start opening up, in some places, maybe if the opening up is a little too quick, and the counts pick up, but it's just a little bit of a bump, and it's something that can be kind of reined back in, I think that will just be taken by the public as, hey, we're feeling our way through this, and if we can respond to these things sort of bumping up and, react to them in a responsible way, that's kind of okay. But I think if there's really a big wave, a big resurgence, and the feeling that people have been rushing this in order to kind of have the optics look good politically for November, I think there'll be a lot of recriminations and retribution at the polls. Mm-hmm. That would be my guess.
Yeah, thank you. This is sort of a changing the topic a little bit. As the urgency of responding to climate change becomes more apparent and accepted, if not, and then what are the opportunities for more fundamental change in how we subsidize and rely on fossil fuels? And of course, this is coming at a time when there was already a price war going on. So what's your thoughts about that? Does that question make sense?
Well, yeah, it does. I do think that, I mean, how long our memories last, I don't know, but I think people are realizing that we don't need to go out driving around as much as we probably did before. Maybe a little bit more of a emphasis on a simpler life. But in the end, I think a lot of that's going to, the climate issue is going to depend on politics as well. The president we have in office at the moment is well known for, his, maybe I should just say his large indifference to the issue, if not hostility. And the other party seems to have quite a different view about that. So I think the nation's path on climate change is very much contingent on what happens in November, both in the White House and to the Senate.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Please discuss the gold standard. I thought the government had to back up the value of the dollar with gold. Is that still true? No,
that's not true. We went off the gold standard for domestic purposes. Gosh, I'm not even sure exactly when, but I think it was certainly before 1950, and then in the 70s, President Richard Nixon in 1971, I think it was, said the U.S. would not honor its commitments to other nations in terms of gold either. So we went off the international gold standard. So no, we have not had the legal obligation to back the dollar with gold or silver anymore either. There was silver backing at one time too.
Interesting, thank you. The stock market is improving while unemployment is getting worse. Who is benefiting from the increase in stocks and who is not benefiting from an improved stock market?
Well, I can give you pay your money, take your choice on that. It's true that ownership of stocks is highly concentrated in the U.S. among the wealthiest families, wealthiest individuals. So there's very much inequality in stock ownership when you look at it that way. But if you look at it from another point of view, a lot of institutions own equities, pension funds, life insurance companies, all of us in some way or another probably have some claim to ownership in stock through pension funds of one sort or another, whether it's a public pension fund or a private pension fund. So stock ownership is pretty broad-based. The stock market is improving even while unemployment is going up because the stock market is forward-looking. So the stock market is going up from its lows because the news about the disease has been better than expected, and the signs about opening the economy are coming maybe a little earlier than people thought they would. So all of this is suggesting to people who are managing these funds and investors that companies are not going to lose as much money as they thought. They're going to start earning money again, maybe a little bit more quickly, and the dividends, are going to get paid. So it's just kind of all based on expectations about a better future than had been priced in previously. Also, note the interest rate on any other kind of really safe investments is now essentially zero. Whether they're going to be CDs or other short-term things, I mean, it's really, really low. So especially after you adjust for like inflation, I'd say 1 or 1.5% inflation, a CD paying 1.5% or 1%, it's kind of a zero real return. So people who are willing to prepare for the longer run, invest for the longer run, think that over time stocks will be a nice way to get a little bit more of a return, and stocks are really cheap now. So that's why.
Okay, thank you. Given the increase in debt, when do you anticipate issues with inflation? So what is the future of inflation?
Yeah, traditionally these really high debt, like debt to GDP ratios, would be raising a lot more concern. But we've noticed, over the past decade or so that for countries like the US and other large developed economies, having a lot of debt relative to the size of the economy doesn't seem to bother investors. They're not selling off our debt. They're not worried about us not being able to repay the debt. Japan has a much higher to GDP ratio even than the US does. And it's able to issue more debt all the time, and it has a very low rate of inflation. So the outlook for inflation in the US actually is for the inflation rate to kind of be pretty soggy. I don't think even, with all the issuance here in the debt, we're going to see inflation projections kind of closer to 1%, that is declining rather than higher. So that's because we have such amount of unused capacity in the US. There's going to be downward pressure on prices with so much excess capacity and people jobless for a long period of time. Companies are not going to be able to raise prices.
Thank you. GDP for Columbus is 66,000 and 71,000 for Cleveland and 83,000 for Cincinnati. Cleveland doesn't have population growth, but how can we grow the GDP in a recession?
So I'm not sure I know where the numbers come from.
I don't either.
Do I want to focus on how do we grow the incomes during a recession?
Yeah, maybe that would be good.
I mean, we're not going to grow our incomes in a recession. They're going to decline. So just as GDP, normally when you see GDP, you think of output, but GDP also is the value of all the income earned in the economy. So if we have declines in GDP for the period of, say, March through, I don't know, pick a month, say August, something like that, incomes are going to be down, corporate profits are going to be down, dividend payments are going to be down. I mean, there's just going to be less to go around. And the federal government is borrowing from the future to channel income to us today. But the amount of borrowing that's occurring and subsequent transfer payments to households, businesses, and so on is less than the income that's being lost. So, we're supplementing some of the declining income by borrowing from the future, but not enough to prevent a complete decline.
Thank you. What percentage of businesses, big and small, do you think will go under during this recession?
I don't really have an informed opinion about that. I just really don't know. I mean, a lot of it, again, depends on these, how rapidly we can sort of open things up. There's, of course, another wave of funding that's come through for small businesses to replenish the money that got wiped out very quickly in the first round. And, I know some business owners who've applied. Some who got money the first time around, some were expecting to get it the second time around. Those are making big differences for those businesses, but it's the amount of opening up that's going to dictate, I think, and how quickly, how this works.
Right. I've got 3 more questions. How should people invest savings during a recession?
Oh boy. Well, as I say, past performance guarantees nothing of the future, and consult your own, tax and investment professionals. Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, it depends a lot on, obviously, your own circumstances and risk tolerance. And, your investment horizon. If you're a younger person and you have many, many, many decades over which to save and accumulate, you can take a lot more risk about what's going to happen in the stock market over time. People at the other end of the spectrum probably want a lot more stability. But I think you can see from the way the stock market has responded to this that, I would sort of take it as an optimistic sign that a lot of investors are looking through this and saying, hey, this is a bad thing for the U.S., but it doesn't look like it's going to be bad for a really long period of time. It looks like it's just going to be very bad for a short period of time. And once we get through this, there's no reason why the economy can't continue to grow again. So that's an optimistic message.
About Social Security. Regarding Social Security, what are the factors that prevent us from removing the cap?
The cap on...
I'm not sure what you meant by it, yeah.
Oh, well, there is a cap on, I guess Social Security taxes are levied against earned income up to a certain limit. And then once you earn beyond that limit, you don't get taxed. It's just a political issue. Social Security is supposed to be, it's just going to be a matter of people deciding that we need more revenue, and they're going to look everywhere to get it, and that's one place. It's been a while since I've seen estimates of this, but I'm not really sure how much more money could get raised from just removing the cap on how much income gets taxed from that. I mean, clearly you get more money, but how much more, I'm not sure that that's like the hugest source of new tax revenue. I mean, we just had a tax reform bill a couple of years ago that really made a lot of changes in taxes that cost about $1 trillion. So yeah, I don't know how much would come from the rate cap, but I don't think it's the biggest place to look.
Right. Another question, I'm concerned the economic pressures to open the economy up will supersede the expertise of the public health officials to flatten the curve of COVID-19. Do you have any advice on this?
Well, I think it's the, it's the 64, we used to say $64 million question, but I guess now these days we just say $64 trillion question. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, the epidemiologists, if they were completely in charge, they would decide about things one way. I guess if, the decisions were made entirely by business leaders, they would have maybe a different cost-benefit sort of calculus in all of this. And this is why we're relying on, our elected officials. This is where, we realize that government matters, and the quality of decision-making and the advice that they seek really, really matters. So, my own personal opinion is in Ohio, we've been really, really fortunate to have a governor who seems to, rely quite heavily on the scientific advice and public health official advice that he's getting. I'm sure there's a lot of pressure to try to get the economy open more quickly than has happened yet in Ohio. I understand on Monday we'll get a lot more information from the governor about the timing and, kind of how he's thinking about this. But I think personally in the long run, if we go a little slower up front, it'll pay dividends a little further down the road, and going faster more quickly to open things up is going to, lead to potentially worse outcomes. That's my calculus. So I think in Ohio, we've we're doing pretty well here.
Right. Has the federal government really supported states enough in this time, or should they do more? And I might add, should the state doing more to help the local governments with loss of income?
Right. Well, of course, in Ohio, we have this long history of the state having the local governments. I mean, the state has withdrawn funding from the local governments that the local governments typically relied on. This goes back to the Kasich era. So the state has taken a lot of those funds, and so the state's been able to build up a nice rainy day fund, but it's kind of been at the expense of the smaller governments. Now, the state's attitude on that has been, well, if you guys want more money, just raise your own taxes and, let your own citizens pay for that. Yeah, I don't know. The federal government does help the states, like on the unemployment insurance. States can go negative in their unemployment insurance funds and owe money to the federal government, and then pay back they get some period of time to pay them back. So they do get some support that way. And as I said, the Fed has set up a program to help the state and local governments with debt issuance. But they do have to pay, they are expected to pay those funds back. Yeah, again, it's a political issue, how much money the federal government is willing to provide the states, and for what purpose. So I don't know. I mean, I don't really have an economic take on that that's just going to be different from the political calculus that's going on here. Clearly, the Democrats have been asking for more, and Mitch McConnell says no. So again, yeah.
Question, 20 years from now, the world will look different financially and otherwise. What can we learn from this crisis that can be valuable to future government leaders?
Well, I think we should just take more seriously the possibility that bad things can happen. And we should, I mean, I think we did learn the lesson from the financial crisis to make the at least the banking system, a lot more resilient, as I mentioned earlier. I do worry, I know there's a question about this, I do worry that over time, memories, fade, and people start looking at a lot of these regulations and they say, oh, that was a long time ago, we don't need this anymore, and let's get rid of it. I would hate to see that happen. In the same way here, I think we did have enough warnings about, we had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had other, Ebola. There've been signs that, our population is vulnerable to diseases that originate in other countries, and we've sort of ignored the planning and the preparation for that, and this is the price that we're paying. So I would hope that 20 years from now, even though I expect the U.S. to be prosperous and thriving as a country, I hope that we'll be more resilient to these kinds of events that can just turn the world upside down, and take seriously the need to be prepared for them.
And there's two last questions I'm going to combine into one, is about the future of universities. Should people continue to borrow for college in today's environment? And how can universities and colleges lower their tuition?
Well, I think we're going to see that, I've taught the last half of my last semester online to my students. It's not as good as being in the classroom, but it's better than I had thought it would work out. I mean, I think ideally some sort of combination of meeting in person from time to time and being online time to time is pretty good. I think there's going to be kind of a rethinking about online education and how to structure that kind of experience, maybe blended in some way with physical, meeting up. That would be potentially a way to get a hold of costs. I think that there is still a great value to having higher post-secondary education. I think people need to be pretty selective about how they spend that time, what kinds of degrees they're taking, how much debt they're incurring. Maybe if people started a little bit later, they'd be a little bit more sure of their judgment about what they wanted to do. So I still think the rates of return on college investment are unequivocally very positive. There are probably more cost-effective ways to do it for some people than others. The worst cases are people who borrow, go to school, and don't complete their degrees. So if you're not going to complete your education and just have debt to show for it, that's a really bad outcome. But I think, so there are smarter ways to go about it, and I think we'll see some more use of online. I think there's just the demographics. There are fewer younger people in a lot of schools, and there's more competition. And if some of these changes are in the direction of, say, fewer international students have been a really great means of income for some higher education institutions. And if that's going to change, the financial situation for some of these universities is going to change, and that's going to prompt, again, maybe the market can't support so many institutions of higher education 20 years from now, and we'll see, more consolidation there and more use of online. That's what I would expect.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll turn it over to Wayne here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sniderman, for an excellent discussion that was illuminating and informative on many levels. At the current time, we don't have another forum topic to announce for this season. This was our last of the scheduled topics. We're contemplating several other topics that we may add on in the next few weeks. If you'd like to be on our forum email list and receive reminders of forums, please go to our website, uucleveland.org, uucleveland.org, and click on Justice at the top of the screen. Fill in your name and email, and we'll add you to our list, and you'll get notifications by email of our future forums as they're scheduled. Thank you once again for joining us. Yeah, Kat White, the president of the Board of Trustees of Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland, I believe is online. And Kat, if you have anything to add about how to see previously recorded forums, are you there? And Kat?
Hi, this is
You are
Kat.
there, great.
Yes, and we will make links available. We will be posting the videos for the for this week's forum and the previous forum on renewable energy. We will be adding those links to the website and possibly links within YouTube as well. So we'll be consolidating our videos in one place.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Sniderman, again. If we had an applause track, I would play it with a tremendous show of appreciation. We thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. All right. Well, everyone, attendees, thank you. And that concludes our forum for this morning.